This is a privilege to introduce Illan Pappe. It's interesting, he's all over my room in the form of books, and he's on my computer in the form of YouTubes that I often watch. But I will not take too much time, but I just must state a few things. Illan Pappe is an Israeli historian and a social activist, a professor at the College of Social Sciences and International Studies at the University of Exeter. He wrote numerous books and articles, including The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, The Modern Middle East, A History of Modern Palestine, One Land and Two Peoples, and Britain and the Arab-Israeli conflicts. A lot more that he has written. Illan Pappe is one of Israel's new historians who have been rewriting the history of Israel's creation in 1948. The corresponding expulsion or flight of 700,000 Palestinians in the same year. He has written and claimed that the expulsions were not decided on an ad hoc basis, but constituted the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. He suggests that Zionism is more dangerous than Islamic militancy and has called for an international boycott of Israeli academics. Illan Pappe supports the one-state solution, which envisages a binational state for Palestinians and Israelis. And with those words, over to you, Illan Pappe.
Thank you very much, Ranjan. And thank you all for inviting me. It's a great honor to share the platform and to be hosted by such brilliant organizations. It's good to see some familiar faces and many new ones. And I hope we will all continue this very important dialogue, and that this will not be just one-off meeting, as a topic like this deserves, I think, a concentrated efforts of analysis, prognosis, and finally a mode of action that is crucial if we want to support the cause of peace and justice, not just in Palestine, I think in the Arab world and the Middle East as a whole. I would like in my 20 minutes to look at three aspects of Christian Zionism with the idea of examining its effect on not just Christian-Muslim relationship, but also Christian-Muslim and Jewish relationship. I think all three monotheistic religions are affected by the phenomenon of Christian Zionism, which is still a very strong movement and an important movement, especially in the United States, but not only in the United States. You should be aware that all over West Europe, there are Christian Zionists with powerful position in the establishment, in the society, and there are even some movements like this in Latin America. So this is an important topic to deal with. The three elements are, the first one is Christian Zionism as the major tool for legitimizing Zionism and its project in Palestine. It is the major tool. It has been the major tool and still is the major tool. And I will say something about that. The second point is the connection between Christian Zionism and anti-Semitism. I think it's very important to understand what lies behind Christian Zionism, or what is the genuine motivation of Christian Zionists when it comes to Jews, because on the face of it, it seems like Christian Zionism supports the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine unconditionally, but it's far more sinister than that, and I would like to say something about it. And the last element is the Islamophobia. The anti-Islamic clear nature of Christian Zionism, which is part of its dogma, its praxis, and its policies in the past and in the present. So let me start with the issue of legitimacy. Zionism in many ways began as a Christian project. before it was a Jewish project. Its roots are in the early 19th century, when on both sides of the Atlantic, a new dogma begins to be suggested by evangelical Christians that has to do with the return of the Jews to Palestine as part of a divine scheme that would lead to the resurrection of the dead, the second coming would precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, and bring us closer to the end of time. On both sides of the Atlantic, important clergymen began to advocate the return of the Jews as a way of indicating that this divine scheme is about to be is about to unfold on the ground. And already in the 1820s, this advocates succeeded in recruiting to their camp very important people, including an American president, an American Supreme Judge, very rich businessmen in the United States. Similarly, in the United Kingdom, in Britain at the time, very senior politicians were also caught up with this idea that a British support for the return of the Jews to Palestine is actually a religious mission. Now, you probably all know that in the 1820s, Palestine was still part of the Ottoman Empire. Britain was very far from exercising direct control over Palestine. But the roots of this support for this idea began with this Christian Zionist idea that the return of the Jews, first and foremost, is a religious imperative. Now, the people who were not part of that religious group itself, politicians, strategists, imperialists, supported it for other reasons as well, not just for religious reasons. But it was definitely the cement that held together all these interests. And under that influence, actually, much later, towards the end of the 19th century, Zionism became a Jewish project. Namely, it influenced Jewish thinkers and intellectuals who were looking for a solution to the growing anti-Jewishness, especially in the policies of Tsarist Russia and other states in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, one can understand to a certain extent why people would lobby for any solution for a Jewish question in Europe at a time when anti-Semitism grew, and at a time that we know now in hindsight, definitely anti-Semitism produced one of the worst crimes against humanity, the Holocaust in the Second World War. The question is not why were people lobbying for a solution or for an end to anti-Semitism. The question is, why were people lobbying to solve a European problem at the expense of the native indigenous people of Palestine? And the Christian Zionists succeeded in recruiting quite a lot of people among the Christian communities around the world to legitimize a solution for a European question outside of Europe, at the expense of the native and indigenous people of Palestine. Now, of course, during the 19th century and even in the early 20th century, suggesting a solution to European problems through colonization of a non-European country, through a project of displacement and replacement of indigenous people, looked quite legal and legitimate and acceptable. This is the era of colonialism and imperialism. So there was no moral objection to the idea. I mean, this is the time when white settlers genocide the Native Americans and the First Nations of Canada and the Aboriginals in Australia. So this was nothing out of exceptional as a solution. What is incredible is not the historical period of legitimacy that Christian Zionism provided for the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine instead of the Palestinians or the expense of the Palestinians. No, what is really incredible is that there is a sense that Christian Zionism today is needed to continue to justify and legitimize the settler colonial project of Zionism in Palestine. It's a conundrum if you think about it, because you have on the one hand a state of Israel, with the strongest army in the region, a high-tech nation, a nation that the Western world insists is part of the group of civilized nations. So materially speaking, this is a very sustainable state, a very successful nation state, you could say. On the other hand, it's the only state in the world that needs a huge lobby, like the Christian Zionist lobby, to justify its very existence, despite the fact that it has such material presence in the historical land of Palestine. No other state in the world asks for legitimacy. And the reason is, we have to ask ourselves, why in 2021 Christian Zionism is needed in the eyes of the Israeli government, in the eyes of the Israeli political elite, to justify its very existence when supposedly it's the most powerful state in the Middle East? And the answer is quite simple, actually. The answer is that there is an immorality that accompanies this project from its very beginning until today. And you cannot fight an immorality, a lack of legitimacy, a moral issue. You cannot fight it with military power. You cannot buy everybody's consciousness with money, or you cannot plant fear in everybody's mind with intimidation. That's why Christian Zionism is so important for Israel, because what they are asking their own believers and faithful to do is not to question at all the reality on the ground, not even to examine either the reality on the ground today or what Israel and Zionism did to the Palestinians in the last 70 or 100 years. They are asked to support unconditionally this state as a stage in a divine scheme that would unfold later on in a Christian way. And therefore, the supporters of Christian Zionism in the United States today are far more important than the Jewish supporters of Israel. And the Jewish support for Israel in the United States dwindles all the time. It dwindles. The younger generation of Jews in America are very knowledgeable of what's happening on the ground. Many of them feel very uncomfortable to go on supporting Israel. Israel is losing its Jewish base in the United States, and not only there, also in other parts of the world. So Christian Zionism, which does not allow its faithful to juxtapose the reality with their own faith, is the only assured lobby that Israel can still rely on. And unlike any other lobby, it gives an unconditional support for the most extreme policies of Israel. It's not just a support for the very idea of the Jewish state. We could see it when you had a vice president who was Christian Zionist like Michael Pence. And before that, when we had a Christian Zionist president like George Bush Jr. This is a carte blanche for the most extreme policies, not just for the ideology of the state. So we have to understand that this, in many ways, is the major infrastructure that is supposed to provide the legitimacy that Israel fails to get, not from governments. Governments are giving Israel legitimacy, unfortunately. Political elite provide Israel with legitimacy. But from struggling against the lack of legitimacy in the civil societies around the world. In fact, if you compare the Palestinian advocacy to Israeli Zionist advocacy in the last 50 years, you can see that Zionism in Israel was very good in recruiting the political elite, the powers that be, the mainstream media, the mainstream academia. Palestinians, even with mere means at their disposal, are always able to recruit and galvanize the civil society. And the main problem, of course, with this kind of advocacy is that civil society alone does not bring change on the ground, and we have to find a way. So this is the first element. The second element, which is very important as a piece of knowledge and information in any kind of campaign, if we want to make this discussion here also a blueprint for action in the future, and not just an intellectual exercise in understanding the phenomenon of Christian Zionism and its impact on the relationship between religions and peoples and cultures. Christian Zionism at its very heart is anti-Semitic, is anti-Jewish. The very idea that really lies behind the notion that the return of the Jews would precipitate the second coming of the Messiah and the resurrection of the dead in the Holy Land. The basic idea below it is that this is the best plan to get rid of the Jews in your country, in your neighborhood, in your city, in your vicinity. This was an intelligent way of exercising the worst kind of anti-Semitism through supposedly a philo-Semitic, a philo-Jewish, a pro-Jewish program that at the time that it emerged, that is throughout the 19th century, very, very few Jews supported. And even at the height of anti-Semitism in Europe during the Holocaust, most of the Jews still believe that the best solution for anti-Semitism is not to support a settler colonial project in Palestine, but to make a better world where any kind of racism would be absent, not just anti-Jewishness. But the very heart of a dogma that is anti-Semitic becomes the main supporter of the Jewish state. And if you look a bit closer at the way Christian Zionism believe that the final divine scheme would unfold, you could see that one important element is that once certain stages are being fulfilled, like the resurrection of the dead, the second coming of the Messiah, the Jews have to convert to Christianity, according to this idea, or they will be barbecued in hell. And this is something which is very important part of Christian Zionism. And this is the reason that until roughly 1992, the labor establishment that led Israel was very careful in establishing official connection with Christian Zionists in America. They were aware that there was a very strong anti-Semitic element in Christian Zionism. The person who changed Israel's attitude towards Christian Zionism was Benjamin Netanyahu. He was at the time Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. He established very strong connection with Christian Zionists. And when he became a prime minister, he totally legitimized these ideas, these connections, understanding that Israel is losing the Jewish community in the United States. And you know, most Israelis think that without the United States, Israel would find it very hard to exist and survive. Finally, and with this I will end, there is a very strong Islamophobic element in this, which you can see from the very beginning when Christian Zionism appears as a clear organization, first in the United States, and then in the United Kingdom, and then elsewhere in the world. One of the major arguments that they are making to politicians and media from the very beginning, beside the idea that this is a divine scheme, beside the idea that this is a good way of solving the problem of the presence of so many Jews in their own societies, and this is a great way of getting rid of the Jews. Beside everything else, there is this notion that what they call the Holy Land cannot be in Muslim hands. And it is in Muslim hands at the time that they emerge as a historical force, because it's under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. So, and even after the end of the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire disappeared as a political force, even after the creation of Israel and the Nakba, the catastrophe, and the expulsion of the Palestinians, it's so easy to find for every pro-Israeli utterance, writing, article, interview of a leading Christian Zionist, the same, it's very easy to find a nasty, racist, Islamophobic sentence or idea or opinion by that very same person who stands at the top of a Christian Zionist organization. The anti-Islamic or Islamophobic rhetoric, the anti-Semitic rhetoric, and the pro-Israeli rhetoric are a mix of the same ideas that provide unconditional support to Israel in very important corridors of power, despite the fact that it's based on negative ideas of racism, hate, and totally disregard to the predicament of colonized, oppressed people like those in Palestine. Surely these immoral aspects of Christian Zionism should help us in the future to struggle against its negative and destructive impact on the ground, as could have been seen when President Trump included these ideas in his deal of the century, which became a brutal assault on Palestinians and Palestine, as brutal as was the Israeli attack on them in 1948. So we have, I think, a moral obligation more than anything else to expose what this phenomenon means and to make sure that it doesn't have the impact that it enjoys on the lives of so many people in Palestine and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Pappe. You have three aspects of the Christian Zionism, which is clear. And we have one question coming up. Who, you want to raise a question directly, or should I mention it? It's in the chatting box.
Oh, I can read it aloud if it helps.
Okay.
Christian Zionism, oops, I missed it. Oh, it's a long one. Christian Zionism has a lot of support from evangelical groups. The latter, while powerful and enmeshed with the political elite, particularly in the United States, are a small percentage of the Christian community. I want to know why the Roman Catholic Church and the mainstream Reformed and Orthodox churches have not opposed Christian Zionism and strongly speak up for Palestinian cause. There is a strong Islamophobia among all Christian groups, communities. I want to say that actually it's very important. Sorry, is that okay? Shall I continue?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So I thought someone was stopping me. I think it's very important to understand that the counter network in America that supports the Palestinian cause is deeply rooted in other churches, also in other parts of the evangelical churches. So it's not as if the whole Christian community in America is behind Christian Zionism. In fact, an important backbone of the solidarity movement with the Palestinians are the Christian communities all across the United States. So the other voice is being heard loud and clear. What is really missing, as I pointed out in my contribution, is that somehow, if you look at it historically, Zionism and Christian Zionism are very successful in influencing the policy from above, in having a presence in the corridors of power, whereas the pro-Palestinian solidarity movement, including in the Christian communities, is a bottom-up movement that has a lot of influence on civil society, but fails to translate this wide support in civil society and translate it into a powerful force that would cause a change of a policy from above. You know, the greatest success of the anti-apartheid movement, or the solidarity with the ANC movement, was the moment when a huge support in the civil society influenced the policies of the government. When you move from boycott, which is a civil society action, to sanctions, which is governmental policies. When we're working for Palestine, this is our main problem. We don't find a way into the mainstream media, into the mainstream politics, and Christian Zionists, on behalf of Israel, have a very powerful presence in these locations. It doesn't mean that we won't be able to do this, but we saw what happened to leaders of the Labour Party in the United Kingdom or representatives of the Democratic Party in the United States, who voiced democratically what most people think about Palestine, how this kind of coalition between a Christian Zionist lobby and a pro-Israeli Jewish lobby was able so far to block their political career, and in some cases even destroy it, just because they expressed genuine pro-Palestinian position. But this is a setback, and we should be able to move ahead despite of it.
I have
Yeah, Nida, why don't you continue?
yeah.
Because this question is related to this earlier question. Go ahead.
I have a question. You said with respect to Christian Zionism, it doesn't allow its faith to juxtapose on the reality. And I would like you to unpack this statement that you said, because there is something clearly psychologically happening here on the people. So
Yeah, definitely. It's in fact, I should refine what I said in many ways, because I know from experience working on the ground in Palestine that the leaders of Christian Zionist churches in America are very worried from a new phenomenon. They sent young Christian Zionists to Israel, into very clear, Israel and Palestine, into a very clear, organized tours. Now, every now and then, maybe because these young people have some free time and they can deviate from the official program, in every case, when even a young Christian Zionist was able to see for 5 minutes the reality on the ground, the checkpoints, the abuse, the destruction, the killing, they came back with a lot of doubts, and some of them became activists on behalf of Palestine. And I can see how every year the Christian Zionists are tightening up the program, almost imposing curfew of the young people who come to Jerusalem, to make sure that they don't see anything that, you know, would create this cognitive dissonance between what they are supposed to believe in and what you see. Even if you believe in the resurrection of the dead and the second coming of the Messiah, that this justify Israeli soldiers beating to death a young Palestinian boy on a checkpoint. What do you do with this? How do you reconcile? And therefore, I'm an optimist about these things. I think that the fact that they need to hide the reality from their faithful, shows that even with such a strong faith that they have, the reality is so powerful, the immorality is so clear, that they would have a problem in the long run in sustaining this unconditional moral support for an immoral project. That's what I meant by that. So I hope this clarifies what I was talking about.
Okay. I'm a little bit concerned about time, but there is a question that the Christian Zionism is now have a much broader influence, as you have mentioned about the Mike Pence role, and this is not merely question of the Palestinian people in the area of the West Asia, but also this is now affecting the total power of the United States and its influence everywhere in the world. In other words, the Christian Zionism has becoming a certain kind of metamorphosis today in the global politics.
I agree. I think that it turned a very compassionate religion, and it interprets it as an ideological base for policies of hate and inclusion, and seclusion, and segregation. And therefore, Christian Zionist ideology is not just about Palestine, and it's not just about Jews. It's about any attempt to create a multicultural, multi-ethnic, inclusive societies. They are totally against it. It's an act of purification and homogenization of human society that is never homogeneous and is always multi-ethnic, also always multicultural, always diverse. And instead of celebrating diversity, they see it, they like to portray it as a threat, an existential threat to their community. I think one should really understand in the 21st century, maybe unlike the 19th century, to my mind, and I may be mistaken here, but for me in the 21st century, it is an ideology, it's a white racist ideology that finds it very difficult to accept that the world has changed, either locally in the United States, where there is a multi-ethnic, complex fabric, social fabric that does not represent only the white community, so to speak, but it's also true in other places. And that's why Islamophobia in Europe in particular is very strong, because this is seen as the last sort of contribution to this diverse society instead of the homogeneous white society. I think we should expose Christian Zionism as one of the worst form of racism. And anybody who even has a modicum of decency in them and find racism appalling, doesn't matter against whom, can really not accept the presence of Christian Zionism in their society and in their country.
Okay, thank you.